So good evening. I'm so excited to be with you tonight in honor of Selichot and my album release, which is also a celebration of Selichot from the Persian tradition. And my album release, which is this Saturday night in Brooklyn, and hopefully Mira will drop that info into the chat for New York area folks, so you can check it out if you're around Saturday night in Brooklyn. And we'll talk a little bit later about what Selichot is, but I wanted to start with that video that gave you a little bit of a taste of one of the songs from my album. And next, I wanted to just jump into what Persian Jewish music is before we get into my album. And I'm going to talk about Persian and Iranian Jewish music interchangeably. So before we get into Persian Jewish music, like any musical style representing many people, it's very difficult to define what that is simply. And for example, if someone asked you what is American music, that would be very difficult to define. And there are a lot of different kinds of Persian music. So I'm going to first give you a taste of Persian classical music. And I'm going to play you one of my favorite singers of Persian classical music. And in the chat, if you could maybe write what you think distinguishes this music from other Eastern or Western music you may be familiar with, that would be great. So tell me what you hear and what strikes you as different or similar. And let's hear a little bit of the next music sample, please. Shushtari.
پیش از این داشت هلالی سر سودای کسی پیش از این داشت هلالی سر سودای کسی دید چون زلف تو افتاد به سودای دگر یا
Thank you. So I see some of your comments here. Some of you sound similar to a muezzin's call to prayer. The singer and the instruments echoing each other, absolutely. And parallels to Turkish and Arabic music, rather than being harmony-based. Absolutely. Yes, you have, let me just see if there are any other non-Western scale, right? Yeah, beautiful. So quarter tone. So all of these things I'm going to speak a little bit about. You heard in there quarter tones, which are notes that basically you don't find on a piano. And so they're kind of the notes that are in between whole steps and half steps, right? We call them quarter tones or microtones. Oftentimes not because they're exactly a quarter, but because they're notes that are not whole steps or half steps. And that's one of the major differences between Western music and many different Eastern kinds of music. And you may have noticed, some of you did notice the vocalist and the the instrument sort of echoing each other. That is very characteristic. And then, of course, you hear some of those vocal styles, this vocal style called tahrir, which is like the breaking of the voice, which might sound like yodeling to some of you. That's very, very characteristic to Persian classical singing. So I wasn't lying when I said that this is my favorite singer of Persian classical music. This is actually a recording of my grandfather, who I refer to as my Saba, the Hebrew word for grandfather. And his name is Younes Dardashti. He was one of the most prominent singers of Persian classical music in Iran. In the 1950s and 1960s, he had his own radio show, weekly radio show before there was television, national radio that everyone listened to every week. He sang at the Shah's palace. He sang at concert halls throughout Iran, and he was known as the Nightingale of Iran. And by the way, the life of my Saba and my Iranian family is the subject of a podcast series I'm working on with my sister, Younes Dardashti. And you'll be able to hear the trailer for it and subscribe beginning this Saturday night, the night of my album release, which we'll talk more about soon. So by most assessments, the brightest period for Jews in Iran was during the Pahlavi dynasty, which is 1925 to 1979, when restrictions against Jews were lifted. And this timing, in part, explains my Saba's rise to fame in Iran. There were a couple other Jewish instrumentalists and a prominent Jewish composer who rose to fame in Iran during this period, but my Saba was really the only Jewish singer to have ever reached this meteoric fame in Iran. And for various reasons, my Saba and Safta immigrated to Israel in 1967 with my uncle, who was still living at home. And for my Saba thought he could continue his career, which he did for quite a while, between Israel and Iran, just flying back and forth. It was, that seems inconceivable today, but he was able to do that up until 1979, when, of course, that was the Islamic Revolution, and he could no longer go back to Iran. Now, he was also, of course, a Jew, my grandfather, and so he would often lead Jewish services in Iran as a volunteer, but there's no profession of cantor or chazan in most of the Middle East and North Africa. If you are able to, if you're a good singer and you know the prayers, you're often asked to volunteer, and that's what my grandfather did. So now we're back to Persian Jewish music. So Jews have been really integral to music in Persia since its early years. Jews came to Iran in 586 BCE with the destruction of the first temple, and many Jews, if you ask them how long their ancestors lived in Persia, they'll tell you since 586 BCE. And in the 7th century, Islam conquered Persia. And Islam has many prohibitions against the performance of music, which were sometimes in effect. And so Jews, Zoroastrians, and Christians were really responsible for maintaining musical traditions during many historical periods. So let's hear some Jewish music, Jewish Persian music, sung by my Saba, Younes Dardashti. And what I'm going to have you listen to is a very short clip of a piyut, or a sacred poem called Im Afes. And it's a sacred poem that is traditionally sung during Selichot, this time before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And this is a poem about the Akedah, the binding of Isaac by Abraham, which I'm sure many of you know that story from the Bible. And here he is chanting this 12th century poem. This is Younes Dardashti, and I'd love you to listen to how his singing is different or not different in this Persian Jewish music. And if we could listen to it, please.
به میثاق خام شنهم نیزهاریم و اهر خالوم هر هریم هاشو و حال خونیم هاریم الاحد هاریم روت تلولو میهرو اشیعلو يا حد بأهباك لولا يشروا وأربا مثلا یاهید که هو هستیم نام لهروم هم نوسیم آوی و تیکن که بسی تحسیم لو تحمل ولو تخسیم.
Okay, we're going to end. So I forgot to ask you to post in the chat what you thought was similar or different, but I really chose this beautiful rendering of my grandfather chanting Selichot to show you how similar Persian Jewish music is to Persian classical music. You know, in this piece, he's singing in Hebrew. The other piece, he was chanting in Persian from a very classical poem. But you can hear that he's using the same techniques that we kind of talked about in the earlier example. And by the way, someone asked in the chat whether that was my grandfather in the archival video in my music video at the top of the talk. And yes, that was some archival video that I found of my grandfather performing actually in Israel with Persian musicians. So this music is very much a shared cultural tradition among Persians of all faiths. And that is a really important fact that I like to always share and have people understand and hear through the music that I teach and the music that I also perform. And Persian Jewish music can be sung in the synagogue, not only solo cantorial or art music, but there are many pieces that are sung by the community, of course, whether on Jewish holidays, after a meal, or in synagogue, and probably more similar to Persian folk music. So I'm going to share a high holiday piece from my album with you. And first I'm going to sing it. And then I will play a little bit of a clip of it from my album. But this is actually the only song on my album that's not from Selichot, but rather from Yom Kippur. And it has a very special place in my heart because this piece is from Ne'ilah, and I grew up hearing my father, Chazan Galeet Dardashti. I grew up hearing him lead this piece in synagogue, and he taught it to me. And so I'm going to share it with you. And if you could share a little bit of just the words of El Nora Alila, so folks can see what it is. This piece is traditionally done at the very end of Yom Kippur in a service called Ne'ilah, which literally means locking. The doors are locking. It's your last chance to kind of make good with God. And so it's very dramatic, and you've been fasting for 26 hours, and it's a very moving part of the liturgy. And I'll share a little bit with you. There's a little bit of El Nora Alila from the Ilah, and if you play just a little bit from my album of El Nora Alila, please. All right, so wanted to just give you a taste of the difference that you might hear with my full band. So I've had quite the journey as artist and scholar playing around with what Persian Jewish music is. I didn't grow up singing Persian Jewish music. I grew up the daughter of a Persian cantor leading in an Ashkenazi synagogue. And we can talk a lot more about that later in the Q&A. But I really had to make an effort to learn this music as both scholar and artist, and eventually make it my own. And so I want to tell you a little bit about my most recent project, which comes out this weekend, and that is my Selichot project, Monajat. So my Saba passed away 30 years ago, and though I was fortunate to have spent some time with him, I didn't really know him very well as a kid, and we didn't have a shared language to communicate. So I wanted to find a way to connect with him, and music, I was very lucky that music offered me this possibility. We had a lot of recordings of my Saba singing in Persian, but one of the few recordings that we had of him singing Jewish music in Hebrew were of him singing the prayers of Selichot. And as some of you probably know, the prayers of Selichot are sung before and during the Jewish holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And they're really said to set the mood for the Jewish high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and put us in the frame for this time of introspection. Now, most Ashkenazim, most Jews of European background only recite one night of Selichot, but most Middle Eastern and North African Jews recite Selichot every night of the month of Elul and in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So that's a lot of nights. Or in the case of Persian Jews who usually recite Selichot at 4 a.m., that's a lot of early mornings. So while sometimes these services happened at synagogue, they often happened in the courtyards of people's homes. And so my Saba was often asked to lead Selichot services, and many Persians, both Jews and Muslims, have very powerful memories of hearing my grandfather chanting from the streets of Tehran. And he ended Selichot services when he would lead them with a piece in Persian as opposed to Hebrew. And that piece was called Monajat. I found the name Monajat on a cassette tape that we had of my grandfather singing these Selichot pieces. And the word translates to English as an intimate dialogue with God. And I asked my family about this piece, Monajat, and nobody knew much about it except that it was a piece that my Saba always ended Selichot with when he led services. It was his unique thing. And it was in a similar style, the words, to the kind of poems that Rumi would write. But when we searched for it, we couldn't find this particular poem. And so after talking to many experts, we believe that my Saba himself wrote this Monajat poem to sing as part of Selichot services. And I was so moved by the way in which my Saba merged the Jewish and non-Jewish aspects of his identity and artistically innovated Jewish practice. And so I created my own piece called Monajat, in which I reimagined the songs from Selichot in the Persian tradition with an incredible group of musicians. And I'm going to just play you a video that gives a 2-minute video that gives some background on this project, Monajat, if you could please play it. I started singing professionally with my family when I was in kindergarten. My grandfather, Younes Dardashti, was one of the most famous singers of Persian classical music in Iran. He sang at the Shah's palace, he sang on the radio, in concert halls throughout Iran. And since he was also Jewish, he would lead services at all different synagogues in Tehran. The few recordings my family had of him singing in Hebrew were him chanting these prayers of Selichot, singing passionately and amazingly. I just always wanted to do something with it, connect with it. And I created this project called Monajat. And I finally got to sing with my grandfather. At the very end,
of his chanting of Selichot, he sings this Persian piece called Monajat. And I loved that because it just showed how intertwined and connected the Persian and the secular and the Jewish, I mean, it was all kind of one for him. I thought, okay, if my grandfather can take liberties with Jewish ritual, it sort of gave me artistic license to do that myself, to kind of reinvent the Selichot ritual from the Persian tradition. I'm grateful that I can do it. You know, with technology, I'm able to sing with my grandfather.
Thank you so much. So, as you heard, my grandfather took artistic license with his Jewish practice. So my project involves some of my own musical compositions, which I added to the Selichot repertoire, and many reimaginings of Selichot. Now, Selichot, of course, anticipates the Jewish New Year, but it occurred to me that many of the themes in Nowruz, the Persian New Year, which occurs in the spring, are similar. Renewal, turning over a new leaf, getting a fresh start. So, for example, I found a Rumi poem that I thought captured these ideas beautifully. And if you could put that song, so that text up, please, for the next slide. And that song is called New Year Invitation, and on my album. I'm not going to play the song, but just so you can see the text. It echoes songs from the Selichot repertoire, like Malecha Nirdam, Why Are You Sleeping? Wake Up and Worship God. And I thought it was really interesting to find a Rumi poem of Nowruz that echoed these same Selichot themes. And so I composed it. And I asked my father to help me find a Persian Nowruz melody to set to it. And so I wrote a Persian Jewish Nowruz high holiday song as part of this album. And there's another song similarly called Wine Song for Spring that is a Hebrew poem written by Moses Ibn Ezra in the Middle Ages that I also composed for the album. And here again, I'm blurring the distinction between the Jewish New Year and the Persian New Year. So if you could put that song on, we'll just we'll go from this is New Year Invitation, but now we're in Wine Song for Spring. If you could go to Wine Song for Spring, thank you. And here you can see the words. Now the sun in its ordained circuit is at the sign of the ram, like a king reclining on his couch. The hills have put on turbans of flowers, and the plain has robed itself in tunics of grass and herbs. It greets our nostrils with the incense hidden in its bosom all winter long. I loved the fact that here, like the high holidays, the Jewish high holidays, we're talking about the king, all these images of the king. And yet here we are in spring for the New Year song. So this is Wine Song for Spring from Monajat. And if you could play that. so much. I saw someone asked in the chat, for some reason the name was covered, but that song is called Wine Song for Spring. And just giving you a little taste since the album is coming out this week. So the most exciting part about this project, about Monajat, is that I get to sing with recordings of my grandfather, which we never sang together in person. And so I wanted to give you a taste of what that looks like by singing with my grandfather live. And I sing this piece with full band in Monajat, but here I'll just sing it, just our voices, and you can get a sense of the call and response that I'm able to do with my grandfather through this project. This is a piece called Anenu, Answer Us, a very traditional piece from the Selichot liturgy. And after this, I will take questions and we can speak some more.
علينا وفهد يسحق علينا Morgen David
how nebet ratson ana no
ane 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 haune bitsam ane
nebet rachamim ane no
ane rahum rahanun ane
Thank you very much. So I'm attempting to continue creating and experimenting with what Jewish music is and can be. And I'd love to take your questions. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming and being with me tonight.
So I did collect a couple questions that would be good to start out with. So Monajat is not just about intimate prayer, it's also about intimate conversation. And something that I'm curious about is what it was like starting this conversation with your grandfather cross-generationally.
It's been a really exciting and moving process for me. Also intimidating because my grandfather was an absolute master. And so for me to dare to sing with him is, you know, a bit chutzpahdik, to borrow from my Ashkenazi side. So it's been all of those things. It's been really, really exciting to be able to find a way to connect with my grandfather, because as I said, I didn't know him that well. I knew him, but we didn't have a deep communication. So to be able to kind of finally study Persian classical music as someone who was very very far in my upbringing from the study of Persian music in any context, it's been really exciting for me to delve into this and to find a way. I speak Hebrew. I don't speak Persian very well, but I do speak Hebrew. And so for me to be able to find a way through the music, through the Hebrew, through my years of studying Persian classical music has been a really deep and exciting journey for me.
And we have a question in the comment, which is, gorgeous style. Is there a song you recommend for introducing Persian music to your congregation?
To anyone's congregation? Well, I would say start with El Nora Alila. That is the one piece that that I learned from my father growing up, and that my father sang El Nora Alila for Yom Kippur, and you still have time to teach it to your communities. My father growing up sang that for his Ashkenazi synagogues. And there are all different melodies for El Nora Alila. So if you want to start with a Persian Jewish piece, I'd say El Nora Alila.
Regarding your father as a cantor, how was he helpful over the course of this project? What was his involvement and input like?
My father has always been so supportive and helpful. My father growing up was the cantor at different conservative with a capital C congregations. And so these were all egalitarian environments where I learned to read Torah and to teach other kids to chant Torah. And it was a very important part of my upbringing, was being able to participate in services and as a woman. And so my father, even though he grew up in Iran, he has been very not only supportive but really wanted me to do to sing sacred music. Now he didn't really encourage me in particular to sing Persian music, but when I expressed an interest, I already knew how to chant from the Torah when I was 30 years old. And I told my father, I've been chanting Torah in the Ashkenazi style. Now I want you to teach me how to chant in the Persian style. He taught me right away. And so pretty much whenever I have wanted to learn anything, my father has been there and been very supportive in teaching me. And in fact, one of the songs on the album, New Year Invitation, which is the Persian piece, my father helped set that piece to a Persian song that he knew. And so I consult with him all the time. And he's really, he has really, he's taught me so much over the years. So I'm very lucky.
Interesting question here. Have you ever encountered any musical exchange in your studying the music that you are between other Persian Jewish groups, like some Aramaic speaking Jews or Jews of Azerbaijan?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. Have I ever encountered?
I think that the question is kind of like, when you've done your scholarly and anthropological work about Jewish music, have you ever encountered reflections of your own culture as a Persian Jew among like other Persian Jewish groups, like I don't know, like Aramaic speaking Jews in Azerbaijan, like Bukharians? Has there ever been a moment where you've been like, oh, those like sound similar?
Well, I've never been able to, my academic research isn't specifically on Persian Jews. So I can't say that I've come across that in my research. That really hasn't been the subject of my research.
do you sing with your parents?
Oh, well, I grew up in a family band. So I grew up performing with my two sisters and my parents. And we really, we took it on the road. we were, we would perform Jewish music, ever since I was a kid. I've been, I think I was on stage singing harmony with my older sister when I was age 3 for the first time. And so my father was a cantor. My mom is a professional musician, and has been, and my parents were performing together before we were even born. I mean, before they were even married, that is. And so, yeah, I have grown up. I was imbued with music growing up. I was very, very lucky to be performing with my family, first with just my sisters and my mom, and later we were a dash of Dardashti sometimes, or the Dardashti family. And we performed, we were very lucky to perform all over the country and beyond. We don't perform as a family together anymore, but what we performed together through, I think through the beginning of my 20s.
How did you learn to sing those microtones?
Well, that I just learned by kind of being in it. A big part of it was, as an anthropologist, a big part of my studies was participant observation. That's what we do as anthropologists. And I was writing about the Middle Eastern music scene in Israel. And I went and I studied Persian classical music with a teacher in Israel. And I was studying Arab music with Yair Dalal. And I really just kind of immersed myself in the music. And it became very, very natural for me, to the point where I don't even always notice whether I'm singing a quarter tone or not. And so if you immerse yourself, it just happens. If it just enters your ear, you listen to it enough, it becomes part of what you are musically, just like how you're a result of all the other music that you've listened to in your life.
So we have a question from an individual Isaac, who is of a Lebanese Jewish background. I wish there was a recording of Persian tunes and pizmonim. Maybe we'll see your next album will be just that. So I guess that's more of a request of.
Yeah, well, what I hope to do is actually to also release more of my grandfather's music. So you can look for that in the future. But here, I mean, I'm really excited for people to hear his voice and to just hear the kind of the majesty of his voice. He was just so amazing, and hopefully there'll be a hunger for more of his music. But I totally agree with the questioner and the response. There needs to be more stuff out there.
Speaking of more stuff out there, we have a fan from the UK who's asking, will it be possible to get your album in the UK? Do you or your band ever come here to perform?
Well, I'm so glad you're asking. We would love to come. Invite us and we'll come.
Okay, perfect.
Get in touch.
Have you ever met other Persian Americans who are familiar with your grandfather's recordings but aren't Jewish?
It's a great question. Yes. And again, a little plug for the podcast, The Nightingale of Iran, that I'm making with my sister, Danielle. This is a question that comes up a lot in the podcast, because actually my grandfather was very, very popular among non-Jews, among Muslims. And so actually, for any time that I interact with an older Iranian Muslim, it's even more pronounced that people say, "Are you related to Younes Dardashti?" My grandfather was a star in Iran on national radio, and so he was beloved by Muslims in particular in Iran. So thank you for asking. It's a very complex issue, because he was perhaps beloved even more by Muslims. But yes, it happens all the time that people ask, that Muslims would ask if I'm related to Younes Dardashti.
We have an interesting question here about, does any Persian Jewish music mention songs about King Cyrus? I think it's something about the geographical proximity of like Cyrus the Great being Persian. I don't know.
Do any Persian songs? I don't know any, but I can't say that they don't.
Okay. So I'm curious about how you came across the physical tapes. Who in your family had them? How had they traveled? Where were they recorded?
Yeah, so the cassettes, they're very well known among Persian Jews, these cassettes of my grandfather singing Selichot. And that is because, like I mentioned, Selichot happens so many nights in Iran, and in the Jewish Middle East. And so when my grandfather would sing Selichot, people would go crazy, and not just Jews, by the way, because you could hear my grandfather singing in the streets of Tehran. So there would be Muslims and there'd be Jews who would be listening outside and saying, "Oh, that's Younes Dardashti." So my grandfather was actually asked to record the prayers of Selichot as a fundraiser in the early 1970s in Iran. And so we had these recordings of my grandfather singing these prayers of Selichot. And I knew about them. I had them. I mean, I'm interested in this stuff. I'm an academic. I'm a geek. So I had this in my family, and it was always just like, oh, this is so amazing. And then it occurred to me that I could do something with these tapes. So they were always there. They were always something that I knew about. I would say from at least my 20s, I knew that these tapes existed, and just fell in love with them.
Were they ever distributed in Israel?
Yes. And again, they weren't ever they were given out to people. My aunt, who lives in Bnei Brak in Israel, she gave them out to a lot of recordings of my grandfather singing Selichot. She made sure that a lot of people had access to these tapes of my grandfather singing Selichot.
Where
Beyond that, I don't know.
Where in Iran is your family from? Which region or regions?
Yeah, so my father grew up in Tehran, and so did my grandfather in Tehran. But my grandfather, his father, and his family came from Isfahan before coming to Tehran. And my grandmother's side, my grandmother actually came herself. She came from Hamadan. So she came from the city that we know as Shushan. My grandfather came from where Esther came from. Maybe my grandmother was related to Queen Esther. Who knows?
I think that the question I would like to maybe conclude with, I am still looking in the chat, but I think we've gotten to most of them, is, what do you imagine your grandfather would say back in this conversation if he could hear your music today?
I hope he would love it. I hope he would be excited that I am continuing this tradition. There's a tradition of musicians in my family, and of course people who led services. But of my generation, I'm the only one, right? And I'm, I guess, the first woman in my family to continue this tradition. But I think my grandfather would be excited about it. He was a very open person, and he was doing creative things musically and artistically, and I would hope, and I think that he would probably be excited about where his music has come to, and the way that his music is now kind of swimming in these different environments and with these different kinds of sounds. I hope you would be excited about it.
Galeet, thank you so much. As you can see in the chat, you also have a lot of people hopping in to actually say they have your grandfather's recordings, including, for the first time in 65 years, I heard your father or your grandfather's magnificent voice. I grew up listening to his songs before immigrating to Israel. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this My Jewish Learning program. Thank you, Galeet. Thank you for sharing your beautiful new music. And you can buy the album on September 9th. A link will be provided in the follow-up, and I think there is also a link in the registration. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight. Good night.
Thank you so much. Good night, everybody. And those of you living in New York, hope to see you Saturday night in Brooklyn. Thanks a lot for having me.